Welcome to the continuation of our LinkedIn clone. In this video, we'll be working on creating a guard for the user. So the way this is going to work is, for now we have our home feed where we have all of the feed posts from all of our users. Now we haven't added functionality for friends, so we're just going to get a list of all of the posts for now. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to add the ability for a user to edit and delete a post. However, if a user is logged in as another user, there wants to be some sort of protection so one user can't go ahead and edit or delete someone else's post. So I'll demonstrate this, what we'll be doing in this video. Now, if we just quickly look at our backend, in our Postgres database here, we have this john@hotmail.com, which is of the type user, and we have this john2@hotmail.com, which is an admin. So essentially the behavior we want here is if I log in as a user, so john@hotmail.com, and we get our JSON web token, if we go ahead and we copy that into our put request. Now, if we have a look at our feed table, one thing we'll note is that the first user, which is just the regular user, created this first post, and the second post was created by our second user, which is the admin. So if we're logged in as our regular user and we make this request to change the second post, we get this 403 forbidden, and if we go ahead and change it to the user that created the post, we can go ahead and create and change the record. Now we want admin to be able to override this, so if I log in as john2@hotmail.com and I make the request, I go ahead and I copy the token and I go copy this in. Now if I make the request, this will work for both 1 and 2. Now if I also go back to the database here and I get another user, so let's say test@test.com, and let's say I sign in as test@test.com and I get the token. Now if I try and change the first record, which was created by the regular user but the first user, if I go ahead and make this request here, we get a 403 forbidden. So you have to be the logged in user to change the created post. And let's go ahead and create this functionality. So returning to where we left off, let's start by going into our API folder. And if we just take a look at that folder structure, and we won't need to work in the front end in this particular video. So basically we got our feed and our auth modules. So within our feed module, this is where we want to create our guard. So I'm just going to use the nest CLI here, nest G for generate, GU for guard, and I'm going to, in the feed module, I'm going to create a guard, so in the guards folder, and I'm going to call this guard is creator, and I don't want any nested folders, so I'm going to make this flat, and I also don't want any spec files, so I'll do a -no-spec. And as we can see, we have this newly created is creator guard. So before I work on the guard, notice that I'm in the feed module here. So before we've created a JWT guard and also a roles guard. However, this is in the auth module. So we're going to need access to the user, and I've put this is creator in this particular module because it's relevant to the feed post. So the feed post, which is in this feed module, has a creator, so it's appropriate to put this guard in this section. So in order for me to use this, I'm going to have to do two things. Firstly, I'm going to have to go to the user module in auth, where we have this auth module here, which also contains the user functionality. So basically what we want to do here is we just want to export the user service, and we need to bring this in. So I'm not getting the IntelliSense that I would like here. So if I just go ahead and type it out, okay, so actually we've already got the auth service. So let's go ahead and bring that in. I'm just getting mixed up between auth service and user service because I am referring to the user role type and whatnot, but I've called it auth service, not user service. So basically I've exported this auth service, and if I just go ahead and press F12 here, this will bring up the auth service. So this injects the user repository and uses the user entity. So we're actually going to need that alongside with the auth service. So basically, if we open up our feed module, we'll go ahead and open that. Basically, we're going to need to import in the user module, so we have access to the user that's attached to the request. So let's go ahead and just bring that in. And once again, this is auth module. In my demo, I've called it user module, so when I'm referring to those notes, I'm getting confused between user and auth, but I thought auth module would be more appropriate because it encapsulates the user as well. So I can go ahead and bring that in, and I'm also going to need to bring in the auth guard that I've created. So I've created this is creator guard, so I'm going to go ahead and bring that guard in, and I'm going to need to import it. So I can go ahead, and now I've got access to the auth service and the auth module within my feed module. So I can go ahead and close those. And if I just go ahead and open the feed controller so we can get a general idea of what we're trying to achieve here. So I go ahead and open this. Like before, when we created this roles guard, and we use this roles guard, we essentially want to have an is creator guard. So we want to put that on this put request and this delete request, because when you post the request, you already have the user that's logged in, and then that created post will be associated with that user. And then when we're getting it, for now, we're just getting all of the records. So we're not basing it off like a friend or anything like that. So we really want to go ahead and have our use guards, and we're going to need the JSON web token guard because that's what puts the user on our request. So we're basically going to want to have something like this, where on our put request here, rather than having this roles guard here, we're going to want this is creator guard. And you could just call it creator guard if you'd like. That's just personal preference. I think the Boolean is creator guard, it really emphasizes that you have to be the creator of the post to edit it and delete it. However, that may be implied by having guard in the name, so that's just up to you. But basically you need to import that as well, so I just check that. So let's go ahead and take a look at our author guard. So our guard by default has implemented can activate, and I've gone into detail about this in the previous video, but essentially it calls this can activate method when you are using a guard. So when you hit this endpoint here, essentially it will go and call this guard, and the first method it will call is this can activate method, sort of like a main method or a lifecycle method like an ng on a init or something like that if you're familiar with Angular. So basically what we're going to want to do here is, since we have access to our user, or we want access to our user, I'm going to go ahead and create a constructor here, and I'm just going to inject the user service or the auth service, which is of the type auth service, and bring that in. And I'm also going to go ahead and get my feed service. Now the reason I'm getting this feed service of the type feed service in here is because the auth service is going to have our user and our user ID, but when we click on a particular post, we're going to need to get the associated ID with that post. So this post here, for example, has an author of ID 1. We're going to want to get this from this feed post table. So we're going to need to reference the entity that type orm is abstracting for us, or overlaying this database table, essentially mapping it to the object in JavaScript or TypeScript. So I'm going to need the ID from the logged in user from the request, and I'm going to need the particular ID of the post and the author of that in particular. So now I have those two services injected, I'm able to use their functionality. And basically it can activate, it returns a boolean or an observable of the type boolean, and if it returns true, that means it will make it past the guard, but if it returns false, that means it will not go past the it won't make it into the request, so we'll just guard it and nothing more will happen. So let's go ahead and delete this return true thing here. If we go ahead and reference what we've done before in the guards of the roles guard, notice that you can get the user from the context, switch to HTTP, and it's actually attached to the GET request. So, well, you actually get in the request, it doesn't have to be a GET request, but the request that you're getting has the user associated with it, because that's how we've set it up in the previous videos. So basically what we can do here is we can go ahead and we can just say, okay, we want the user, and we also want the params. And I might actually go ahead and just change this. It's not always better to have 2 lines if the code isn't readable. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this the request. And basically, since we have the request, that means we're able to use object destructuring. So we know that the user is associated with the request because that's been enforced through our JWT guard. So if we get that out, and we can also get the params out. So if we have a look at our feed controller, we have these parameters. Now I'm going to be using the param ID, so I can infer the type. I know, well, I can typecast the type. So I know for a fact I'm getting the user, which is of the type user, and I'm getting the params, and I know that in the params I'm getting an ID of the number as shown in this feed controller. The param attached to the request has an ID of the type number, and I should probably even add a type to this user, so it's not necessarily implied, although the role is, because we have this role here. So I'm just going to go ahead quickly, and I'm just going to just say this is of the type user, is of user, and just bring that in, and then bring the interface in. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that. And I'm also going to do the same thing here. So I've got a user of the type user and the params, which has a nested object of the ID in it. If you had more params, you could add a comma separated here. And this is coming from the request object. So now we've got our type set up. We can just do a quick check here. So basically, if there is no user or there is no params, so they've made a request without the params for whatever reason, basically we just want to return false. So they'll just exit out of this guard, and then the controller will not even call the functionality that comes along with the controller. That's delegated to the service. But I got the user, so I know that a user has a role associated with it, and since we've got the role, we're going to check if the role is an admin. Now I know this guard is it is to check if the user is logged in as a user. However, an admin should have privileges above a user. So an admin can change anyone's post even if they didn't create it. So I'm just going ahead and I'll allow admins to do that. And I might just comment this in here because I'm going to post this onto GitHub. And if things aren't clear, it's good to have a comment there. So basically I'm going to abstract the user ID. Now this is coming from the user request, which is essentially set up through the JWT service. So we can just go ahead and get that ID. Since we got the JWT guard working first, we got access to the user, and remember it will be defined if it makes it past this check here. And I'll go ahead and I'll do the same thing for the feed ID. So when we get the particular post, in the params we're going to indicate which post we've clicked on. So I can just go ahead and I can get the params ID. Now I've already coerce this to a number, so you're getting it from the URL as a string. However, when you specifically say you have a number, and in the controller here we've got this parameter ID as a number, the type will work out. So basically what we want to do now is we want to determine if the logged in user is the same as the user that created the feed post. So what we can do here, now we're going to have to create some methods here, because we have our auth service, which has a bunch of methods like relating to hashing the password, creating an account, validating the user, and logging in. But we're going to need to find the user by ID, because for our logged in user, we're going to need to pass in this particular ID that's been attached to the request. This is coming from the backend from JWT, so it's not being passed in. And we want to check that against the particular feed ID, who created that, the author of that. So we're going to need to have a method in our auth service just below login here called find user by ID. And of course this is going to take an ID of the type number, and using the RxJS approach, we will be using observables, and it's obviously going to return a user because we're finding a user by their ID. So like our other observables, we're going to use the user repository, which returns a promise, but we're going to convert it to an observable using the from operator. So we can go ahead and return this observable from, and we can go ahead and we can say for the user repository, we'll just go ahead and copy this here. The user repository, we should have a method on here, and there's a method called find1. Now we can set, we want to find the ID that matches our ID, or for short we can have ID, and we are going to have a relation here, because if we look into our models, into our user entity, we can see that we have this one-to-many relationship to our feed posts. So we can go ahead and say in this second object here that we're configuring, we can say for the relations that the user repository has, it's related to the feed post table. Now this is the observable that we'll be working with, but in its current state it's actually finding the user from this table here, which also has this password here. Now we don't want to return that to the user, so we'll go ahead and we'll just delete that. So what we can do is, if we want to return the user based off this observable, we essentially want to return the user object. So since we're going from this observable into a user object, we can use the pipe, and we can pipe into the observable, so we can use the pipeable operators, so we can use the map operator, so we can map the observable that we're getting back. So we're getting the user back, and we can go ahead and we can just delete the user password, and then we can go ahead and we can just return the user. So with this, we have typeorm doing its magic, so it can essentially run the query for us based on the ID we pass to it, and the user repository has a relation to the feed post. We delete the user or the user's password and then return the user back to them. So that means we can come here and we can say, we can come here and we can essentially say, okay, well, we want to return true if their ID matches the feed post ID. So we're actually going to have to do some nesting here. So we don't actually have the feed post ID just here. We're going to need to get the feed service for that, but we're returning an observable. So let me just go ahead and start writing it out. If I go ahead and I use this auth service here, and I use that method I just created, and I pass in that user ID coming from the request, basically I am expecting a user back, but I don't want to return a user, I want to return a Boolean. So you might think that I would use the map operator here, as we did before. However, I'm going to need to use the switch map operator here because I'm going to need to return another observable. So recall that this is turning an observable which returns the user, and we will need the user, but before we use the user and check the ID from the user, we want to also return the observable where we find the particular post by the ID, and then we want to compare the author ID from the post to the user ID that's attached to the request object. So that means we need to actually go ahead and use a switch map because we've got an observable of the type user, and then we want to return another observable, and we want to basically return the feed post. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go open up the feed service, and I don't have a method here to find the post by ID. I've got find post, find all posts, but I don't have find a singular post by the ID. So I'm going to go ahead and say find post by ID, pass in the ID, which is a number, and what I would expect back would be an observable of the feed post type. So basically we're going to return an observable using this feed post repository, and so we convert it in an analogous way to how I explained before. And you just go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and use this find one method, and we can once again get it find one by the ID. So when the column ID is matched to the ID that we passed into it, and once again we have a many to one relation here. So many posts have one author, so we have this relations here, and we just go ahead and we say it's got related to the author as defined in the entity. So find post by ID, let's say we want to find post 1, would have the ID 1 here, and this will refer to the author, the first record in the users table. And since we're returning a feed post here, we can go ahead and we can pipe into this first part. So we basically, what we want to do is we want to combine the result from the feed service, which returns the feed post, a singular feed post based off the ID, with the result of the find user by ID. So that's just, if I type in user 1 here, this 1 here, that's what we'll get this whole record back, and then we want to compare this record here to this post here, essentially, to make sure that this post is created by that first person, and then we will have access to update it or delete it. So now we have both those methods. We need to combine them. So we have this service find user by ID, pass in the user ID from the request. Now we pipe into it, and this is where we use a switch map operator, because we don't necessarily want to do anything with that user that we got just yet. We will, but not immediately. So we know we're going to get a user back from this, and I'll go ahead and control period switch map to get it from the operators, and this should be a lowercase s. And basically I can go ahead and I can return something. So this is what we want to return here, is this feed service, and we want to use that find post by ID method that we just created, and this is where we can go ahead and use our feed ID. Now we want to pipe into this observable, because this is returning the feed post, and this is returning the user. So we return the user. We use a switch map operator to return this next observable, and then we pipe into that. But what we really want to return is just a true or false statement. So I just want to compare the result from the user to the author of the feed service. So I can just go ahead and I can use the map operator now, and for that feed post I'm getting back from this find post by ID, we know this is going to be of the type feed post. So I might actually need to bring map in as well, so let me do that. So, and feed post. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, and you could essentially make this a one-liner and not use the curly brackets here by returning an expression. But I'm going to go ahead and make this clear so it's readable when I come back to the code. So let is author be equal to if the user ID is equal to the feed post author.id. And if that's true or false, we just go ahead and return the evaluation of that expression. If it's false, well, we're returning false, and like how we return false if there's no user or params, it will not make it past this guard. If the user ID is equal to that ID, then we get the author is the creator. So now that we've created that, all we need to do is just apply it and check it works. So let's go to our feed controller here. Now we've already put the JWT guard and isCreator guard here. So all we really need to do is just test it works. So let's do that. So I'm going to run an npm run start :dev, as defined in our package.json script that we get with Nest by default. Now we're just going to let things get mapped to the routes. Now we see this Nest application has successfully started. So what we'll do is we'll do exactly as we did in the beginning of the video. We'll just go ahead and we'll check the route. So let's first log in as the regular user. We get our JSON web token back, copy it in, go to our feed route with the put one. So this user should be able to change this. And if we make the request, we say it works. If we try and change to, which was created by an admin user, so not this user, we get our forbidden. If we go ahead and log in as our admin and copy that token, we should be able to make both the requests. So 2 works, which is the creator, but also 1 works. So admin overrides. And finally, if I go to the test case, log in. Now I'm not the user, so I would expect to not be able to make this request. And same thing for this one. And just for completion's sake, if I go ahead and get the delete method here, let's say I want to delete the 20th record here. I'm just going to come here. I'm going to type in 20. Now I'm going to change this back to John 2, which is the admin. So the admin should be able to delete it, even though he wasn't necessarily the one that created it, although in this case he is. So I might go ahead and delete the first record actually, because, well, we can delete the 20th as well. So we'll check that he can delete his own record. He can. Can you delete the first record? You can. So let's just check this in our feed post here. So there's no first record, there's no 20th record. If we go ahead and we log in as the regular user, now there's no way for me to check because I've deleted the only record made by that user. I could create another record, but if I go ahead and copy this token here, and I go and I want to delete number 2, I'm now forbidden to do that. So in this video we've set up the auth guard for the creator. Now in the next video I want to go ahead and I want to use that, and now I want to actually return to the front end, and I want to and I've turned off, the server's not running, but when I click start post it comes up with a modal, and I want to actually be able to add a post to the top of the list, and this is an infinite scroll, so there's going to be some configuration in setting that up. And I'm also wanting to add perhaps like an X and an edit button here, such that we can go ahead and use our newly created is the creator guard to check for things, to see whether or not the user is the user that can go ahead and make those particular CRUD operations. So yeah, thanks so much for watching this video, guys. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.